Let's get real. The rights you think are guaranteed, your voice, your protest, your so-called freedom, didn't come from polite debate or waiting for permission. They were wrestled out of the hands of people in power by students who were willing to risk everything, get arrested, and defy a system built to shut them up. This is the episode where we rip the mask off American free speech and show you how it's always been a fight, never a gift. We're talking about Mario Savio, a guy so dangerous to the status quo that the FBI put him under surveillance for a decade. Politicians lined up to crush him, and campus leaders begged him to just go away. Spoiler, he didn't. If you're part of the so-called silent majority who's fine with letting things slide, you might want to find a safer show, because this isn't for the comfortable. It's for the people who are done watching injustice and ready to raise their voices, the ones who know that rights don't survive unless someone's willing to make noise. We're about to drag the stories of repression, surveillance, and rebellion right out into the sunlight. So if you're ready to stop watching history happen and start making it, you're in the right place. This is your warning. Turn up the volume or get out of the way. Welcome to today's episode. Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores experience and meaning and their impact on individuals and the broader society. Let's talk about the free speech movement, FSM for short, because this wasn't just another college protest. It was a massive, drawn-out rebellion that took over UC Berkeley during the 1964-65 school year. There wasn't really a single boss running the show, but if you had to name a face of the movement, it would be Mario Savio. He was a grad student at Berkeley and somehow became the beating heart of the whole thing. But he wasn't alone. Other key names you'll hear are Jack Weinberg, Tom Miller, Michael Rossman, George Barton, Brian Turner, Bettina Aptheker, Steve Weissman, Michael Thiel, Art Goldberg, Jackie Goldberg, the list goes on. Now picture this. Thousands of students coming together to pull off what became the first huge act of civil disobedience on any American college campus in the 1960s. What were they after? Honestly, nothing that radical. They wanted the university to stop banning political activity on campus and to recognize their right to free speech and academic freedom. Pretty basic stuff, but at the time, revolutionary. The FSM was inspired by the New Left. It took cues from the civil rights movement and later ended up fueling the anti-Vietnam War protests too. Decades later, you can still see the ripple effects in how students and activists everywhere talk about protest and free speech. A little background. Go back to 1958 and you'll find students organizing Slate, a political party on campus. The idea was to run a unified slate of candidates to demand that student groups be allowed to get involved with off-campus issues. This was before the 60s got wild, but you could already feel the rumble. By the fall of 1964, some of these Berkeley students had actually traveled with the Freedom Riders and spent their summers helping register black voters in Mississippi. They came back to campus fired up, setting up tables and raising money for civil rights causes. But here's the catch. Berkeley's rules only let the official Democratic and Republican student clubs do political fundraising. If you weren't in those, tough luck. And it wasn't just the students feeling the squeeze. The faculty had to sign a loyalty oath or risk getting canned, which led to a whole storm about academic freedom. For a lot of the FSM crowd, the U.S. government looked like a machine for racism and imperialism. They wanted to keep pushing, taking inspiration from radical thinkers like C. Wright Mills, and fighting to end these gang rules on campus. Everything boiled over on September 14, 1964. Dean Catherine Towle made it clear. From now on, university rules banning political advocacy, outside speakers, recruiting, and fundraising at the Bancroft and Telegraph intersection would be strictly enforced. It was a line in the sand. Then the spark. October 1st, 1964. Jack Weinberg, a former grad student, is working the core table, Congress of Racial Equality. Campus police come up, ask for his ID, he refuses, and boom, he's arrested. Instantly, students swarm the police car, refusing to let it move. This spontaneous sit-in lasted a wild 32 hours, with Weinberg stuck inside and up to 3,000 students surrounding the car at times. The best part? They turned that police car into a stage. People were giving speeches, holding debates, and keeping up a non-stop public discussion until the charges against Weinberg were dropped. That's how the free speech movement really caught fire. Right there, with a car that wouldn't move and students who wouldn't shut up. On December 2nd, somewhere between 1,500 and 4,000 students packed themselves into Sproul Hall. This wasn't just a stunt. It was a last-ditch move to force the university's hand and get real negotiations going about the tight restrictions on political speech and activism. They weren't just protesting rules. They were also outraged that 4 student leaders were being singled out for punishment. But this wasn't chaos. It was practically a campus festival. Students were studying, watching movies, singing folk songs. Even Joan Baez showed up to lead the crowd and offer support. Teaching assistants turned one floor into the freedom classes, where students could learn about civil rights and organizing. Someone even held a special Hanukkah service in the lobby. And then, out on the steps of Sproul Hall, Mario Savio gave one of his most legendary speeches, one that would go down in activist history. I'd like to read a substantial chunk of that speech right now, a speech that became known as the Bodies Upon the Gears speech. Quote, "That's what we have here. We have an autocracy which runs this university. It's managed. We were told the following. If President Kerr actually tried to get something more liberal out of the regents in his telephone conversation, why didn't he make some public statement to that effect? And the answer we received from a well-meaning liberal was the following. He said, 'Would you ever imagine the manager of a firm making a statement publicly in opposition to his board of directors? That's the answer.' Well, I ask you to consider, if this is a firm, and if the board of regents are the board of directors, and if President Kerr is, in fact, the manager, then I tell you something. The faculty are a bunch of employees, and we're the raw material. Don't mean to end up being bought by some clients of the university, be they government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone. We're human beings. And that brings me to the second mode of civil disobedience. There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart, that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part, and you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all. That doesn't mean, I know it will be interpreted to mean, unfortunately, by the bigots who run the Examiner, for example, that doesn't mean that you have to break anything. 1,000 people sitting down someplace, not letting anybody by, not letting anything happen, can stop any machine, including this machine, and it will stop. We're going to do the following, and the greater the number of people, the safer they'll be, and the more effective it will be. We're going, once again, to march up to the second floor of Sproul Hall, and we're going to conduct our lives for a while in the second floor of Sproul Hall. We'll show movies. For example, we tried to get Un Chant de Mort, and they shut them off. Unfortunately, that's tied up in the court because of a lot of squeamish moral mothers for a moral America and other people on the outside. The same people who get their ideas out of the San Francisco Examiner. Sad, sad. But Mr. Landau has gotten us some other films. Likewise, we'll do something which hasn't occurred at this university in a good long time. We're going to have real classes up there. They're going to be freedom schools conducted up there. We're going to have classes on the First and 14th Amendments. We're going to spend our time learning about the things this university is afraid that we know. We're going to learn about freedom up there, and we're going to learn by doing." End quote. So here's where things escalated. Just after midnight, the Alameda County Deputy DA, a guy named Edwin Meese III, calls up the governor, Pat Brown, basically asking for the green light to make a mass arrest. The answer? Go for it. Not long after 2 a.m. on December 4th, police surrounded Sproul Hall. By 3:30 in the morning, the arrests began. Nearly 800 students were taken into custody. Cops loaded them onto buses and hauled them almost 25 miles out to Santa Rita Jail in Dublin. Most of them were released a few hours later on their own recognizance. No bail, just a promise to show up for court. So what happened after all that chaos? Eventually, the university caved. Slowly, grudgingly, but they caved. By early January 1965, Berkeley had a new acting chancellor, Martin Meyerson. He came in and set up new, temporary rules for campus political activity. Suddenly, those famous Sproul Hall steps, they became an open forum for discussion during certain hours. Student groups could set up info tables no matter where they fell on the political spectrum, not just the lefties behind the free speech movement. But let's be real. Most people on the outside still saw the FSM as a radical left-wing rebellion. And it did open the floodgates for more activism. After that first big win, students who were anti-Vietnam War and critical of U.S. foreign policy found it easier to organize and be visible. In fact, just a few months later, the Vietnam Day Committee kicked off, marking the start of mass anti-war activism on campus. This was the first time anyone brought the tactics of civil rights disobedience to a college campus. Sit-ins, mass arrests, peaceful but relentless protest, all of it gave students real leverage over the university. And the template stuck. Those tactics powered protests against the Vietnam War and beyond. The FSM wasn't just a one-off, it lit a fuse for campus activism across the country. Berkeley's campus was never the same. The FSM turned out to be a turning point for civil liberties activism in the 60s. The era of big, loud, and sometimes unruly student activism had begun. And honestly, it's still simmering today, even if the volume's been turned down. Not everyone was thrilled, though. There was a serious backlash. Ronald Reagan won the California governorship in 1966, running on a platform to, quote, clean up the mess in Berkeley, unquote. Once in office, he wasted no time. He pushed to fire UC President Clark Kerr, blaming him for being too soft on the protesters. Meanwhile, the FBI was busy too, keeping secret files on both Kerr and Mario Savio, and making their lives difficult through COINTELPRO. Now, if you're hearing COINTELPRO and wondering what that's all about, let me give you the quick version. COINTELPRO was the FBI's covert and honestly pretty dirty counterintelligence program aimed at spying on, disrupting, and undermining activist groups and leaders all over the country. We're talking civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and anyone who challenged the status quo. And hey, if you want the whole wild story, I've got several episodes in the archive that dig deep into COINTELPRO's tactics and targets. Definitely worth a listen if you want to see just how far the government went to keep movements like this in check. For a lot of the public, all these protests, civil rights, anti-war, student demonstrations just blurred together. News footage and documentaries made sure everyone saw what was happening on campus. If you want to see some of that history, a lot of those photos, videos, and artifacts live in the Bancroft Library at Berkeley now. And the most iconic image? Students in suits carrying the free speech banner through Sather Gate in 1964. There's even a replica of that photo at the entrance to the Free Speech Movement Cafe. A quick flashback. Earlier protests against the House Committee on Un-American Activities in San Francisco back in 1960 had already set the tone. Students being hosed down the rotunda steps became organizing fuel for a new generation of activists. Let's talk about the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC for short. This was basically Congress's own Red Scare task force, set up way back in 1938. Their job? Hunting for so-called disloyal or subversive Americans. Anyone they thought might be linked to communism, whether they were regular people, public employees, or whole organizations. HUAC became a permanent committee in 1946, and later in 1969, they switched up the name to the House Committee on Internal Security. The committee itself didn't last forever. Congress shut it down in 1975, and its work was folded into the House Judiciary Committee. Now, a lot of people connect HUAC to the whole McCarthyism mess, and for good reason. But here's a twist. Joseph McCarthy himself was never actually involved with HUAC. McCarthy was a senator, running his witch hunts in the Senate, not the House. So while HUAC and McCarthyism get lumped together, they were actually separate operations, just running similar "are you now or have you ever been a communist" vibes on opposite sides of the Capitol. The FSM has had its fair share of homecomings. The 20th anniversary in 1984 brought out big crowds and featured Mario Savio breaking a long public silence. More panels, more rallies, more storytelling. The 30th and 40th anniversaries drew both veterans and newcomers with famous names like columnist Molly Ivins giving memorial lectures. After Savio's death, the reunions turned more reflective, honoring him, remembering fallen friends, and recognizing the impact they'd had. Today, Sproul Hall and Sproul Plaza? Still protest central. Any day of the week, you'll find people handing out flyers, tabling, or setting up for a march. These steps are now officially named the Mario Savio Steps. Want to grab a coffee with a side of history? The Free Speech Movement Cafe sits right on campus, a living tribute to what went down. And don't miss the Free Speech Monument in Sproul Plaza, a 6-inch hole in the ground surrounded by a granite ring. The ring reads, "This soil and the airspace extending above it shall not be a part of any nation and shall not be subject to any entity's jurisdiction." It doesn't mention the FSM by name, but the spirit is all there. Free speech, autonomy, and the refusal to bow to anyone's authority. If you ever want to know whose words and courage fueled that spirit, you don't have to look any farther than the man who set the tone for the whole movement. Let's talk Mario Savio, the guy whose name you'll always hear if you talk about the free speech movement at Berkeley. He wasn't just another protester, he was the voice of the movement, famous for his fiery speeches, especially that legendary Bodies Upon the Gears address that he gave on the steps of Sproul Hall in December 1964. Even now, Savio is remembered as an icon of the early counterculture movement. He grew up in New York City. His dad was an Italian immigrant who designed restaurant equipment, and his mom worked in retail, both deeply Catholic. Young Mario was an altar boy and thought about becoming a priest. He graduated at the top of his class from Martin Van Buren High in Queens, landed a scholarship to Manhattan College, and later transferred to Queens College. By the summer of '63, he was in Mexico with a Catholic relief group, literally digging latrines in the slums to help improve sanitation. After his parents moved to LA, Savio headed west too. He enrolled at UC Berkeley in late 1963. It didn't take long for him to dive into activism. In March '64, he was arrested along with 167 others during a protest against hotels in San Francisco that refused to hire black workers for anything but menial jobs. While sitting in jail, someone asked if he'd be heading to Mississippi that summer to join the Civil Rights Project. Turns out he would. That summer, Savio joined Freedom Summer in Mississippi, helping Black Americans register to vote and teaching at the Freedom School in Macomb. One day, walking down a road in Jackson with a friend, He was attacked for simply being there. The FBI eventually got involved after President Lyndon Johnson opened up investigations as civil rights cases. One attacker got off with a $50 fine. The experience and the violence he witnessed in the South changed him forever. Savio saw firsthand that racism and brutality weren't just Southern problems, they were symptoms of a nationwide system that kept people in their place. So let's talk about Freedom Summer, a bold, nonviolent push in 1964 where civil rights activists set their sights on breaking Mississippi's stranglehold on segregation and exclusion. The planning started in 1963 when groups like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, decided it was time to shake things up. Their idea? Bring in hundreds of mostly white college students from up north to spend the summer in Mississippi. Their mission? Help local black residents register to vote, set up a new political party, and open up freedom schools where folks could finally learn real history and politics. Back then, black Mississippians were completely shut out of the Democratic Party's primaries and caucuses, so the activists decided to take on the system directly. They challenged the all-white delegation's right to represent Mississippi at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. And they didn't stop there. Black residents held their own freedom election in November and went on to challenge the all-white Mississippi congressional delegation's right to speak for the state in Washington the following January. This wasn't some peaceful summer camp. Far from it, the volunteers and local activists faced horrifying violence. Murders, bombings, kidnappings, and torture. The brutality was so extreme it made national news and forced the country to finally pay attention to civil rights in the South. That national outrage mattered. It helped push Congress to finally pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and not long after, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Funny enough, nobody called it Freedom Summer at the time. Back then, everyone knew it as the Mississippi Summer Project. The new name came later, but the impact still felt today. Still, let's take a step back. Why did Freedom Summer need to happen in the first place? What made Mississippi ground zero for this kind of struggle, and what came out of all that risk and sacrifice? So first, let's look at why did Freedom Summer happen? For almost 100 years after the Civil War, segregation in Mississippi wasn't just a social norm, it was the law. Most black Mississippians couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, and were shut out of good housing, schools, and jobs. Pretty much every opportunity you can name. The deck was stacked. Most families lived in brutal poverty, stuck under the thumb of white landlords, bankers, and bosses, with police and groups like the KKK keeping everyone in line, often with violence. And if a black resident tried to push back, the consequences were deadly. Beatings, jail, eviction, murder. So why did SNCC and CORE decide to send so many Northern volunteers, most of them white college students, into this powder keg? They hoped that by putting, quote, respectable, unquote, white faces in the middle of the action, the national media and federal government would finally be forced to pay attention and step in. The plan wasn't just about registering voters, it was about exposing the system, building a new political party for black Mississippians, and laying the groundwork for a real shot at power once the voting rights barriers came down. So what did Freedom Summer accomplish? If you want to know how much shockwaves one summer can send, look at Freedom Summer. People across the country saw, often for the first time, just how violent and entrenched Mississippi's white power structure really was, thanks to TV footage of bombings, beatings, even killings of civil rights workers. This wave of outrage didn't just change minds, it changed laws. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 got a serious push from the public pressure created that summer. For black Mississippians, Freedom Summer wasn't just about voting, it was about learning how to organize, building political experience, creating connections, and figuring out how to play the system. So when the federal government finally stepped in to protect their rights, people were ready to run for office, serve on school boards, and make real change. But it wasn't all hope and progress. By fall, many organizers were burned out and frustrated. The violence, the lack of federal protection, and especially the Democratic Party's refusal to seat the new integrated Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, left a lot of people questioning whether nonviolence or the system itself could ever really work. Leaders like Malcolm X and Kwame Ture, who then went by Stokely Carmichael, started talking openly about getting rights, quote, by any means necessary, unquote, planting the seeds for the Black Power movement and groups like the Black Panthers. So what happened after Freedom Summer? The fight didn't end in '64. The Voting Rights Act of '65 finally gave the federal government teeth to enforce voting rights. By 1966, more than half of African Americans in the South were registered to vote, and over the next few years, Black leaders were elected as mayors, school board members, even police chiefs. A lot of the SNCC and CORE staff took the skills they built that summer and went on to serve the public in huge ways. John Lewis went from SNCC leader to congressman. Mary King helped run the Peace Corps. Julian Bond led the NAACP and became a major force in Georgia politics. And many others became professors, lawyers, or civil servants. As for the Northern Volunteers, that experience launched a whole generation of activists. Mario Savio, who you've already met, took the fire from Mississippi and helped kick off the Berkeley free speech movement. Others, like Chewed Pam Parker Allen and Barney Frank, went on to lead women's liberation groups and break new ground in LGBTQ rights and public service. A lot of people who went through Freedom Summer spent their lives fighting for justice, whether it was in the courtroom, in politics, or on the front lines of social change. And for some, that fight picked right back up the moment they got home. Back at Berkeley, Mario Savio tried to raise money for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, but the university had slammed the door shut on all political fundraising and activism. Savio put it bluntly, "Are we on the side of the civil rights movement, or do we just slip back into the comfort of Berkeley and forget the people we worked with?" He couldn't forget, so he fought. His big moment came on October 1st, 1964. Jack Weinberg, another activist, was running a table for CORE, C-O-R-E, the Congress of Racial Equality, which we've already talked about. Now, if you're not familiar with CORE, let's hit pause for a second. I've mentioned it a few times, and I'd like to talk about why this group mattered so much. The Congress of Racial Equality, better known as CORE, was a powerhouse for civil rights, especially for African Americans throughout the movement. CORE's been around since 1942, and their whole mission has always been simple but bold: equality for everyone, no matter your race, gender, religion, background, or any other label you can think of. Early on, they made headlines for their hands-on activism. Picture this: young college students climbing onto Greyhound buses for the Freedom Rides, rolling straight into the Deep South to take on segregation head-on. As CORE's reputation grew, chapters started popping up all over the country. Now, it's not all rosy. Like a lot of activist groups, CORE had its challenges. Some folks have pointed out that a lack of organization and clear leadership in later years led to a drop in participation, but they're still out there fighting the good fight. Here's something cool. CORE's strategy for nonviolent protest was inspired by Mahatma Gandhi. They took cues from Gandhi's campaigns against British rule in India, especially his ideas around civil disobedience and peaceful resistance. One of Gandhi's protégés, Krishnalal Sridharani, even wrote a book called War Without Violence that helped lay the groundwork for CORE's approach. Back in the day, CORE chapters worked a lot like grassroots labor unions. You had regular meetings, volunteer committees, and officers who were elected, not paid. In the South, CORE went after Jim Crow segregation, job discrimination, and fought for voting rights. Outside the South, they targeted unfair housing practices and school segregation that happened even without explicit laws. Not everyone inside CORE agreed on everything. There was real tension between those who wanted to stick to nonviolent action and others who believed in armed self-defense, like the Deacons for Defense and Justice, who promised to protect activists by any means necessary. This debate got heated, and by the mid-60s, CORE's leader James Farmer tried to incorporate rising Black Power ideas into the group. It didn't quite work out, and he eventually stepped down, handing the reins to Floyd McKissick. By 1961, CORE had more than 50 chapters across the country, and just 2 years later, they'd expanded into most big cities and college campuses, not just in the North and West, but deep into the South, too. Bottom line, CORE was everywhere, and they were relentless in challenging discrimination and pushing America to live up to its promises. So that's the kind of group Weinberg was repping when the showdown happened at Berkeley. When campus police arrested him for not showing ID, as the cops put him in the police car, someone in the crowd yelled, "We can all see better if we sit down." That sparked a 32-hour sit-in around the car. Savio climbed up, after taking his shoes off out of respect for the paint job, and fired up the crowd with speeches that made the plaza electric. When a temporary deal was struck with the UC president, Savio stood up and told everyone to leave quietly and with dignity. But that was just the beginning. Negotiations failed, so the students escalated, and on December 2nd, the movement occupied Sproul Hall. Savio delivered his famous Bodies Upon the Gears speech to a crowd of 4,000 and then got arrested along with 800 others. Later, he served time in jail and told reporters he'd do it all again. By April 1965, Savio stepped back from the FSM, frustrated by the growing distance between its leaders and the student body. But his impact was done. The template for student protest was set, and his words still echo anytime students demand their voices be heard. But stepping back from the spotlight didn't mean stepping out of the crosshairs. Even after Mario Savio left the front lines of student protests, the powers that be weren't ready to let him go. If anything, the system turned its gaze on him even harder, setting off a whole new chapter of quiet battles fought in the shadows. Let's start by looking at the FBI surveillance. Turns out the moment Savio climbed up on top of that police car, he landed himself on the FBI's radar, and he'd stayed there for over a decade. The media didn't even uncover this until 1999, while Savio was inspiring students to speak out. The feds were following his every move. There was zero evidence he was a threat or had communist ties, but the Bureau decided he was dangerous simply because of his power to get students fired up. Even after he left the free speech movement, the FBI called him into their Berkeley office. They said they'd gotten some threatening letters about him, but refused to talk with his attorney present. Savio wasn't having it. He wouldn't meet with them alone, and used the opportunity to call out the FBI for ignoring human rights violations in the South. The agents shut down the meeting pretty fast after that. The FBI files on Savio run hundreds of pages deep. They collected private info from schools, banks, and phone companies without a warrant, snooped on his marriage and divorce, and monitored him through informants, fake professors, journalists, you name it. They even got his tax returns illegally, mischaracterized him as a threat to the president, and coordinated with the CIA to keep tabs on him when he traveled abroad. Worst of all, they put Savio on a secret list of people to be detained in a national emergency. No judge, no warning. Under COINTELPRO, he was labeled a key activist to be disrupted and neutralized. The Bureau only ended the investigation in 1975 when Congress started looking into FBI abuses of power. Years later, Savio's ex-wife called it what it was, a total waste of money and a violation of their privacy. After the fire of the free speech movement, Savio's life took a bunch of unexpected turns. He did everything from working retail in Berkeley to teaching at Sonoma State. In '65, he married Suzanne Goldberg, who he met during the FSM. And not long after, they packed up and moved to England. Savio had landed a scholarship to Oxford. Their first son, Stefan, was born there, but Savio didn't finish his degree, and by early 1966, the family was back in California. Savio never stopped caring about change. In '68, he even ran for state senate in Alameda County on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. He didn't win, but honestly, the guy was never afraid to try something bold. The next few years were tough. He and Suzanne had a second son, Nadav, but split up soon after, with the usual heartbreak and fallout. Savio hit a really rough patch. He struggled with depression and at one point showed up homeless on his friend Jackie Goldberg's doorstep. It was a hard fall for someone who'd once roused thousands. And in '73, the FBI was even notified he'd been hospitalized. But the story doesn't end in the dark. In 1980, Savio married Lynn Hollander, another FSM alum, and soon after went back to school at San Francisco State. He nailed it, graduating summa cum laude in physics and then picking up a master's in '89. He even had a theorem named after him by one of his professors. In 1990, Savio and Lynn moved with their son to Sonoma County, where he taught math, philosophy, and logic at Sonoma State. He mostly kept a low profile, but couldn't resist jumping back into protest when the university raised student fees. Sadly, Savio battled heart problems, and after a heated public debate with the Sonoma State president, he suffered a heart attack, went into a coma, and passed away on November 6, 1996. Savio's legacy is massive. After his death, a memorial lecture fund was created in his honor, bringing some of the sharpest voices in activism and scholarship to Berkeley every year. Names like Howard Zinn, Cornel West, Amy Goodman, Angela Davis, Elizabeth Warren, Robert Reich, and more. They also started the Mario Savio Young Activist Award to recognize new voices fighting for justice and human rights with the same fire Savio had. The steps of Sproul Plaza, the same ones he stood on to make history, were officially renamed the Mario Savio Steps in 1997. Berkeley even has a free speech monument cafe named for him, and if you visit, you'll feel the vibe of history echoing in every cup. Savio's words still resonate. Anonymous used a clip of his speech during the Empire State Rebellion in 2011, and the Occupy movement constantly cited his activism as inspiration. Sproul Plaza in Sebastopol and Speaker's Corner at Sonoma State have both been rededicated in his name, places meant for people to speak out, organize, and keep the flame burning. And just in case you're not familiar with Anonymous, the group that put Savio's words back into the spotlight, they're a loosely organized international activist collective known for high-profile cyber attacks on governments, corporations, and all kinds of powerful institutions. Anonymous really took off in the early 2000s, popping up from the online chaos of 4chan, and became famous for that iconic Guy Fawkes mask from V for Vendetta. Depending on who you ask, they're either digital Robin Hoods or a cyber mob. Supporters call them freedom fighters, while critics label them cyber terrorists. Either way, they've been called some of the most influential people on the planet, and every now and then they pop back up to make a statement, always with a flair for drama and digital disruption. If you want to see Savio in action, check out the documentary Berkeley in the 60s. His passion is impossible to miss. The film doesn't just spotlight Savio either. Berkeley in the 60s traces the whole arc of the free speech movement, starting with those wild 1960 House Un-American Activities Committee hearings at San Francisco City Hall, then jumping into the birth of the 1960s counterculture right in Berkeley, and wrapping up with the battle over People's Park in '69. It's packed with interviews from 15 former student activists and loaded with archival footage, not just of Savio, but other big names from the time. The film's a tribute to Fred Cody, who founded Cody's Books in Berkeley, and it was even nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature. If you missed it on the big screen, it also aired on PBS's POV series, so you can still track it down. If you take anything from Mario Savio's story, let it be this. Change doesn't happen when we sit quietly. It happens when we speak up, shake the system, and refuse to be silenced, even when the machine tries to grind us down. Ordinary people do move history. So don't wait. Take up space, speak your mind, and push for the world you want to see. And hey, if you're fired up by this episode, here's your challenge. Drop a comment below, something bold, something honest, even something that'll make the algorithm sweat a little. Share this story with a friend who needs to hear it. Hit subscribe if you want more voices that don't pull punches. Most of all, get out there and start some trouble of your own, because history's waiting for the next person to climb on the car and say enough. Find your steps. Find your voice. Whether it's online, on campus, at work, or in your community, Don't wait for permission. Organize, speak out, and keep that fire alive. If you're inspired by this story, share the episode, drop a comment, and most importantly, take some action of your own, because the next movement could start with you. Don't let silence win. Keep making good trouble. That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring experience and meaning in individuals and the broader society. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these talks, and in the meantime, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.